What I want to do is do my first stage of compression and take a second to kind of talk to you about what compression really is. I think it's the hardest thing to master when you're mixing or producing, because the definition of what a compressor does doesn't really help you understand what we use it for. What a compressor does is turns down the signal when it gets too loud. As the signal starts to increase in volume, a compressor will recognize it's getting too loud and automatically turn it down. The point of this is to even out the performance. So you don't have loud spikes and quiet parts, because if the source material is jumping around too much in volume, it becomes impossible to put it in any one spot in your mix and have it be a good volume. Now that sounds really simple. However, in practice, it can be very difficult because music and sounds and general have to jump around in volume. And it's a good thing. It's not always a bad thing when they jump around in volume. We refer to it as dynamics. But not all the dynamics that we have in our recording are something that we want necessarily. And we use a compressor to kind of rein things in and smooth out or even out a performance. And they kind of, when you get good at them, they can do more things. They can even out sounds, not just in an entire performance, but just in a single hit. And we'll look at what that means. The controls on a compressor that you really need to worry about are threshold, ratio, attack, and release. These are probably the most confusing things about a compressor, is figuring out what does what. So I'll try to explain it as best as I can. Even if you know what a compressor does and you use them before, it's always good to kind of go back to the bare bones and remind yourself what it does. I mean, I still watch videos online of like, what does a compressor do? Because someone might explain it in a different way where I think, oh, wow, that's really interesting. I never really thought about it that way, and that might spark a new idea when it comes to mixing. As a signal increases in volume, we see a change in the decibels, and that's what your threshold is going to be measured in. The threshold, when you set it, is the level at which the compressor starts to turn things down. So it kind of works in a reverse fashion when you first start to use a compressor. The more you turn a threshold down in terms of decibels, the more it's working, the compressor. If your signal is kind of staying at, let's say, minus 20 decibels for the most part, and then jumps up, gets louder to minus 10 decibels, if you set your threshold to minus 20, as soon as it goes above minus 20, the compressor actually kicks in and says, oh, I need to start working, I need to start turning this thing down. The amount it turns it down by is set by your ratio. And the reason it's done as a ratio is because it can't just turn it down by any standard amount. The more it goes above the threshold, the more it has to turn it down to try to keep it even. So a ratio, for example, of 2 to 1, if it goes 2 decibels above the threshold, then the compressor will only allow it to increase in volume by 1 decibel. You're essentially cutting the change in half. 4 to 1, if it goes 4 decibels above your threshold, it only allows it to increase by 1 decibel, so on and so on. And this is one of the kind of tougher things to really master when it comes to compression, because your gut instinct is to turn your ratio really, really high so you can see the compressor working. Like, why would I ever want it to go above a certain level? But then we find that there's negative sides of that, and sometimes you don't want to completely wipe out the dynamics of something. You just want to rein them in a bit, and that's why you might use a low ratio. So we'll look at that when we put it on a track. Attack and release are very difficult to master. Essentially what they do is, attack is when the sound goes above the threshold, how quickly does the compressor react to it? And when the sound goes back below the threshold, how quickly does the compressor allow it to return to its normal volume? Again, instinctively, we kind of think, well, obviously I want it to be as fast as possible. I don't want any lag between when the sound goes above my threshold and when the compressor actually starts working. I'm going to set it quick. And we find that that has negative impacts on some sounds as well, or it could be exactly what you need. The trick here is setting those so that everything sounds natural, but you can also kind of in a weird way misuse them to make things sound unnatural but very, very cool, and we'll learn how to do that and how to go about it. So let's take this, actually I want to do the bass first on this one with this compressor. It's kind of a cool one to see. When you're using a compressor, metering is your best friend, especially if you don't really trust your ears yet on what you're doing. Being able to see the compressor work with your eyes can help you out a lot. Compressors are a little trickier to learn than EQs because EQs we hear the change quite drastically. Whereas a compressor, we might not hear the change as much. We just have to trust that it's working. So here we have our normal compressor limiter that comes with Pro Tools. It's very simple. There's nothing fancy or flashy about it, but I use it all the time, especially for what we're about to do and just evening some stuff out. It doesn't impart any sound or character into the thing you're doing. So if all you're using it as a tool to fix something, it's a great one to use. So don't be shy about using stock plugins. Sometimes they're great. But let's take a look at the controls here on what a compressor can do. This little slider here, which is connected to this knob here, that's your threshold. I like the metering here. It's really obvious in terms of what it's doing. It lets you set your threshold very visually. We're going to see once we hit play, the threshold, where you place it, you're going to want to set so that when the level goes above it is when you start to compress. For now, I'm going to do what I always do. I set this to my kind of default doesn't do anything settings, which means threshold all the way up. Not down like you might think if you're first using a compressor, all the way up, because the level will never get above the top. So the compressor won't work at all, and that's what I want for right now. I'm just going to set this very neutral. Here's my ratio, which means, again, once it goes above the threshold, how much is it going to work? How much is it going to turn it down? I'm going to turn this all the way down 1 to 1. 1 to 1 means even if it goes above the threshold, it doesn't compress at all. Now my attack and release controls, what I'm going to do is something kind of interesting. I'm going to set my release medium, just straight up for right now. I'm actually going to set my attack as slow as possible. Again, this is sometimes counterintuitive on certain compressor models. On this particular one, slow is all the way up. You can kind of see by the time that it shows you there. All the way up to 300 milliseconds. If you go down, it goes way down. But that's actually faster, and then as you turn it up, it goes slower. Is the amount of time it takes for the compressor to start working when the level goes above the threshold. So I have this bass track. The first thing that I want to do is I'm going to take a look at it and listen and see how much the level of this bass is jumping up and down as it plays. Now, this is a human being playing the bass, so it's not going to be perfect. No human being can play the bass with perfect volume on multiple hits. So it's going to be jumping around a little bit. Let's take a look at how much it's jumping around. I want you to keep your eye on the input meter here, and that'll give us an idea of the kind of dynamics that we have in this bass part. Let's see here. So you can see we have some that are hitting up here around -3 decibels. We have quite a few hanging out here at -6. And then we have a couple stragglers that are around here at -12. And then obviously this last sustained note, you see the volume drops down to about -20 something. So quite a big range in dynamics. At the very quietest, at the tail end of that last note, it's down at -20. And then at the very loudest, it's up here at -3. That's a very wide swing in volume. The first thing I want to do is just kind of gently compress this to see what it does. So I noticed that the peaks were around -3, I was averaging around -6, and then I had a couple of low ones around here around -12. So what I want to do is I'm going to first set it to -3, or maybe just a little bit below, -3.2. Theoretically, at this threshold, I'm not going to get much compression because I think my loudest one was at -3. So I might only be compressing one note here. But I'm going to set my ratio now. I'm going to turn it up a bit, and I'm going to turn it to something about medium. I usually start around 3 to 1 or 4 to 1. It's a nice kind of medium compression. About right there. And let's see what happens. I bet we're not going to see much of anything at all. Again, my level is not getting high enough to where my compressor is going to kick in. So even though I've set my settings to where it actually might compress, not getting anything. I need to bring my threshold down. Let me bring it down to the average level, which was about -6. That's where most of the notes were hitting. And here we're going to see if we get anything. So if we were compressing, we'd see two things. We would see this gain reduction meter start to light up, telling us that we're reducing the gain, and we would notice that our output is not matching our input anymore. because we're reducing the volume as it goes above the threshold. But we're not seeing that, even though it's going above the threshold. So why is that? The reason for that is I have my attack set too slow. Right now, there's a 300 millisecond kind of lag, or it takes the compressor 300 milliseconds to turn it down once it goes above the threshold. However, these peaks are happening so fast that by the time 300 milliseconds passes, we're back below the threshold. So the compressor is never actually kicking in. I'm going to leave it right where it is. I'm going to start to turn my attack faster until I start to see the compressor be quick enough to start to grab those peaks. So here I am turning it down, getting faster with my compressor, and we should start to see the gain reduction light up every time it goes above the threshold. There we go. Saw a little bit of orange there. There we go. That last note there got a good amount of compression. So every time you see this orange light up, that means the compressor's automatically turning it down. There we go, a little bit there. So this is barely any compression, but we're starting to see it work. And we're starting to see why it didn't work when I had the attack set too slow. It needs to be quick enough to actually grab those peaks as they come by. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to bring my threshold down. And as we bring it down, we're going to start to hear the compressor really, really kick in, because just about all the notes are going to trigger the compressor. I'll do it over here. There we go. So now just about every note on this compressor is triggering it. And you can see there's a difference now between our input volume and our output volume, which is exactly what I'm expecting to see. You can kind of see our input jumps around quite a lot, where our output stays more or less in the same spot. If I bypass it, you can kind of now start to hear how it jumps around a bit, whereas this is very even. Now, obviously, when you do this, you're losing volume on your track. I'm reducing it by between 3 and 6 decibels here. So I'm losing some volume on my track because my compressor is always turning it down. Now it's turning down the really loud notes a lot. It's turning down the quieter notes just a tiny bit, but it's turning all of them down as they come by. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this control, gain, or some compressors call this makeup gain. And what I'm going to do is give myself back some volume. I'm going to probably add 4 or 5 decibels. All right, so this right here is the interesting and really cool thing about compressors. By definition, what a compressor does is it takes your loud stuff and makes it quieter. Now, the way I want you to think about it is not like that. I want you to think about a compressor as it's not taking your loud stuff and bringing it quieter. It's bringing your loud stuff and quiet stuff closer together. Because when you use makeup gain, what you're actually doing is bringing the loud stuff that got compressed back up to its original volume, but now the quiet stuff that either isn't getting compressed or got compressed less is now increasing in volume. So even though a compressor takes your loud stuff and makes it quiet, when you use makeup gain at the end of it, and in the context of a mix, what it really does is take your quiet stuff and make it as loud or almost as loud as your loud stuff. You're evening out the difference between your loud and quiet. So this does a couple things. One, it can even out a performance like in this bass part. Now I don't have those notes that jump out as much when the player hit too hard. The other thing that it kind of has the ability to do is this quiet stuff I'm talking about might not be a single hit that's a little bit quieter than another hit. It might be the tail end of something, or what we hear as detail. So a compressor can actually bring out the detail of a track that you weren't hearing before. So let's listen to it now. I'm going to bypass it now that I have makeup gain on there, and we'll look at the difference in volume and try to hear the difference in the sound. I'm going to bypass it first so we hear the original. Now in. So visually looking at it, it seems like my bass is staying at one volume, a loud volume, more consistently than it was. What I'm hearing is that the bass sounds more in your face all of the time. It's not kind of punching and going away and punching and going away. It's just kind of staying there right where I want it to be. Again, let's listen to it. Bypassed. You can kind of hear how some of the notes are loud, some of them are quiet. I'm getting a lot of that initial pluck, then it dies away. And there it's in your face all the time. Now what I want you to do is keep an eye on the meter over here in Pro Tools on the channel here to kind of just see the difference of what's going on. Without a compressor, you can see how it's jumping up and down quite a bit. It's pretty erratic. With a compressor, it pretty much just hovers in one spot. With my bass hovering in one spot like this, makes it way easier to mix. In terms of where you're going to place that fader, the relative volume in your mix, because if the level is jumping around all the time, there's no one spot you're going to put that fader where it's going to fit in there. So what I did with this compressor was even out uneven dynamics. Hits that were too loud compared to other hits are now the same volume as them. I used my makeup gain to get my low level hits up to where my high ones were. I had to set my attack quick enough to where it actually grabbed the bass. If it was too slow, the peaks would go by and the compressor was not reacting to them. Just for fun, what I'm going to do is kind of bring my threshold way down, and you can kind of hear what happens when you squash something. And I'm going to mess with the attack controller so you can hear how sometimes purposefully getting it to be slower can let some stuff through, some pops through. So let me bring my threshold down here. Give myself some more makeup gain back. So now I'm pretty much crushing this bass. Let's check it out. When I move my attack as fast as it will go, you can hear some distortion now. A little bit of fuzziness coming on there. But my level's staying in one spot. Let me start to move it slow, and you can start to hear those pops from every hit come through. Now it's more uneven, but those little finger pops are coming through now because they're quicker than how the compressor can react to it. So I'll put it back where it was, where I liked it where it was, just making stuff nice and even. Let me bring this back down. Give myself just a nice, decent level of compression here. Nice. So you can kind of hear there, even with this compressor, I'm not doing a ton with it. I'm just making it a little more even. You're not going to solve all your problems with just this one compressor going on there. I'm not enhancing it really too much. I'm just kind of going, there's some notes that are sticking out, some that are a little too quiet. I'm going to put a compressor on here that's going to even them out, so at least my bass just stays in one spot. And we'll come back to it a little bit later if we put an enhancement compressor on there to do a little more fun stuff with it, and we can see. Now, we didn't touch the release control at all with this one. I'm not going to show it to you on the bass because it's a little bit tougher to hear sometimes on this, but on the drums we'll hear it a lot. Release, in my opinion, is the hardest one to master. And you can use it many different ways to kind of help you get different sounds. But basses love compression. Bass is really good for keeping that low end solid in the same spot in your mix, especially you want that low end to be kind of always there, so you can really compress a bass very evenly and get rid of any unwanted dynamic stuff, and it creates a nice little low end bed for your mix. But let's look at some drums real quick, especially the snare drum, to really see how these attack and release controls can work. Now, even just looking at my snare drum track, there's not a whole lot of variation in dynamics between these hits. There's a couple that are a bit louder, a bit quieter. I can see this guy here. It's a little bit louder than that guy, so I could put a compressor on there to even those out, but for the most part, This snare drum track dynamically is really good. There's not a whole lot going on there. But I want to show you how you can use a compressor to not just even out a quiet hit versus a loud hit, but how we're going to use it to even out the quiet part of a hit compared to the loud part of a hit. Now, a drum is a very transient instrument. It hits and then goes away. Now we're going to hear with the snare drum, it has a nice little ring going off of it, and you can even see kind of this fishtail looking thing, meaning that it volume spikes up and then dies away really quickly. Let's give it a listen real quick with no compression on it. So you can even hear and see it's a quick spike and then it dies away very quickly. But all the spikes are more or less in the same spot, so that's good. You don't have to fix too much there. All right, so let's put our compressor on here. Again, I'm going to set this to my kind of default, not going to do anything levels. Threshold, all the way up. Ratio, all the way down. I'm going to set my attack all the way slow. I'll keep my release kind of medium here for the time being. Let's take a look at these levels before we do anything. So more or less, they're all peaking up here around -6, couple going down here at -12, up here at -6. But look at the difference in volume between where the peak is and where the ringing is. The ringing's way down here at below -30. All right. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my threshold down to maybe -12. I'm going to even out some of these hits. Set my ratio up here, maybe 4 to 1. Now again, even though it's going above the threshold, I'm not hearing any change or seeing any change because my attack is set too slow. Start to move this faster until it starts to grab. There we go. Now you can see it's compressing the really loud ones quite a bit. Some of them aren't getting compressed at all. And then some of the medium ones are just getting compressed a little bit. And my output here is much more even. I'm probably losing a couple decibels in volume, make up for it with my makeup gain here. I'm trying to get these to be as even as possible. Let me bring this guy down a little bit more, my threshold. So even the ones I'm seeing that are going above it are still going above it too much. I'm going to turn my ratio up. When it goes above the threshold, I want it to compress even more. I want to even this out even more. That's working a little bit harder. Make attack a little bit faster here. Let's see. Now look at this volume here on my track. All the hits, all the peaks are about the same level. I'm not hearing a huge change in the sound. All right, I'm actually quite happy with this. Now, what I want to do now is alter the transient response of this, meaning I'm going to use a compressor in a weird way that's going to bring out the detail of it as opposed to just even out the performance. Now, I can't do that with this compressor. If I start to do that with this compressor, I'm going to lose what I just did in evening out my individual hits. So I'm going to add another compressor on top of it. There's no problem with using more than one compressor. In fact, I highly recommend it. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But let's go nuts with this compressor. I'm going to go threshold up, attack all the way slow, ratio down, medium release. All right, now I have some nice even hits here, but look at my attacks are up here, my ringing is down here. So check this out. I want to bring out the ringing of this snare drum in comparison to the attack. So I want to set my threshold to where the volume of the ringing is, and what I'm going to do is then essentially turn down the level of the attack. You get, again, a medium ratio. Now you can hear, even though it's compressing, you can hear that pop coming through. Pop, pop, right? My attack is set too slow. What's happening is the attack is coming through, and then 300 milliseconds later, the compressor is actually kind of getting down to the volume that it needs to get to. So my pops are still coming through. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to turn this attack all the way fast. Now you can hear it clamping down on the attacks. Give it a little bit of volume here. So now the relative volume from the initial pop of that snare drum and the tail end of it, they're closer together because I'm clamping down on the pop and you can hear the ring coming out more. But here's where we get to really have some fun with release. This is once it goes back below the threshold or starts to approach it, how quickly does it allow it to turn back up? So let me go all the way quick here. We're getting lots of ring now. The initial pop is being turned down by the compressor, and then once the ringing happens, it falls below the threshold, and relatively speaking, the ringing is the same volume almost as the pops. If I set it too long, the compressor will actually still be working when the ringing is happening, and all I'll have done is turn my entire snare track down. So you can see here the compressor doesn't even get back down to no compression, and all I've essentially done is turn my snare drum down by like 20 decibels. So that's way too long. But one thing that you can try to do with this is time the release so that it just lets go right before the next hit. And you can kind of see, even on your meters, now obviously that's really aggressive, that's not a great sounding snare, but when you kind of crush it like this and get a lot of gain reduction, you can start to mess around with that release control and see really what it does, how it's letting go of the volume at different rates. Now here's an example of how I can use the attack purposefully slow to enhance part of the drum. I'm going to turn my release back down to pretty quick, medium quick. I'm going to start to bring up or slow down the attack on this, and you're going to start to hear that pop of the snare drum come through because the compressor won't be working fast enough to grab it. And listen to what that does relatively speaking to the sound of this. So right now it's set as quick as it can. It's grabbing all the pops, the initial hits. It's softening up my snare drum because of it. At some point, it's going to start to sneak through as I make my compressor slower. Starting to hear it now. So hear that about right around 20 milliseconds. I'm getting now a kind of exaggerated pop sound out of my snare drum because the compressor's not working quick enough to grab it. In fact, I've, in a weird sense, tricked the compressor into turning down the initial ring after that pop because the pop's happening, 20 milliseconds later the compressor's going, oh my god, I need to turn it down. It starts to turn it down, but by the time it's happened, that pop's already gone and now we're into like the tail end of that snare drum. So here's without the compressor and with it. You can use this to your advantage to actually make it sound like the drummer hit the drum harder than they actually did. You have to be careful with it. It can get really annoying if you have too much kind of pop going on in your snare drum, but this is a kind of creative way to use a compressor, kind of tricking it into bringing out something that it's supposed to be turning down. If you need to clamp down on that initial pop of the snare drum, make sure you have your attack quick enough that it can grab it. Or if you want to let it sneak through, make sure you have your attack slow enough that it won't. Let's hear what the release does, a slow release versus a quick release with this kind of tricky setting. Turn this up a bit. There we go. Let's try a slow release first. So you can hear with this slow release, about half a second, the pop is getting through, and then the tail end of the snare drum, which probably lasts about half a second, is all getting turned down. So now I pretty much just have the initial stick attack of the snare drum. But let's hear what happens when I turn my release quicker so that it lets go while the ring is still happening. You kind of get this like boing effect because the pop is happening, the compressor is turning down real quick, and then realizing it's gone back down below the threshold and letting it come back up. And without a compressor, with it. So this is how a compressor can kind of be used more as transient design. You're altering how a single attack or strike or note of an instrument can be altered in terms of what you're hearing relative to another part. It's not just for evening out a performance. So using this kind of funky, inappropriate setting for a compressor, we're bringing out the pop and also the tail end of that ring and kind of getting a dip initially after the pop, and it gives the impression that the drum's being hit harder than it really is. Now, right now it's kind of aggressive. I don't think I would use this much in a track, but it might be nice to add a little bit of this. I'm gonna bring my threshold back up. Which means I gotta bring my gain back down. So just that little bit of kind of compression with that slower attack and that faster release, you can kind of hear how it's bringing out just a little bit of detail in that snare drum. So this is an example of kind of enhancing after you fixed. We put the compressor on it to even out the individual hits, and now I put one on to enhance a part of the snare drum. This is the snare drum is a great instrument to learn how to use these settings of a compressor because it's so aggressive in its attack, and hopefully if the drummer's good, they've done a good enough job of not being too dynamic from hit to hit where you can kind of hear the change and what you can manipulate in this. All right, so we've got this snare that we've now used a little bit to even out and then a little bit to enhance. We have our kick, which didn't really need that much evening out, and just a tiny, tiny bit enhancement. Again, I'm not trying to make any huge drastic changes here, just trying to make it a little tiny, tiny, tiny bit better than what it was. But let's look at something a little more fun, like an overhead or a room with compression. Now, overheads and rooms are kind of interesting because you're at the mercy of the relative volume of the kicks and snares and the hats and toms, and they're all going to peak at different volumes. So let's put a compressor on here. I'm going to do the same kind of thing. We'll see how much fun we can have with this. Bring that all the way up, ratio all the way down. Let's move our attack all the way slow. Cool. So we can even just see here on our metering, the snares are hitting up around here, minus 10 decibels. Kicks are right here, about minus 18. Hats are down here, about minus 30. So let's bring it down to minus 30, our threshold, so that we compress the kicks and snares, but not the hats. Turn my ratio up to a good medium ratio, about 4:1. Now I'm going to start to bring my attack quicker so it starts to clamp down on those hits. There we go. I lost some volume, obviously, so I'll bring it back with my makeup gain. All right, so without compression, with compression. You can hear the relative volume of those hats came up. The ring of the snare came up. The body of the kick came up. This is a great example of using a compressor to bring out the detail of a track. Let's mess with the release a little bit to see when it's set really slow, it doesn't let that detail come out. It's still turning the tail end of stuff down. So if I set it quicker, now we start to hear it. If I set my attack really quick, I'll probably clamp down too much of those initial attacks and it might soften up my kick and snare. Kind of hear how we lose that pop. Takes the percussiveness out of the drum. So that's a little too quick for my taste. Right about there, the pop's coming through, but I'm also still getting the detail to come out. Without a compressor, with a compressor. Let's try it again with the rooms. Sometimes rooms you can get really aggressive with the compression. All the way up, ratio down, attack slow. Alright, I'll move my threshold down here so I'm getting everything but the hats. Ratio, let's go pretty aggressive, 20-1. Ooh. So you can kind of hear this is making the drums kind of sound like they're exploding a little bit every time it hits. Kind of soft and pillowy. Really smacking. Again, attack too quick and I'm going to clamp down too much of those things. I'm going to lose the pop on my drums. Attack just slow enough that it lets the pops come through. Release too slow, and the compressor can't let go quick enough to get the next hit. So I'll move it just slow enough that it's maximizing the amount of ring. No compressor. Compressor. I'm going to do something real quick. I'm just going to move these down so I can turn them all off at the same time because my snare has two compressors on it. Just put all my drums in. I didn't put any compression on my hat. I usually don't. So that's with no compressors, or I should say without the enhancing compressors on my drums. And then with them. And you can kind of hear how they're giving the impression that the drums were played harder than they really were. More attack, more body. Brings out the detail quite a bit. Now, is this always something you should do? Definitely not. The song might not call for that kind of extreme of a change in the sound of your drums. But if you find that you need to alter the way that a drum develops, whether it's the snare drum or the kick drum or the overheads, you can use a compressor to do that, to bring out elements of the drum that you couldn't hear before. Or you can use it to rein in elements of the drum that are too in your face, like the initial stick attack if you need to soften up your drum a little bit. Or, like we did on the snare drum, we have two compressors. One, because all the snare hits were not the same volume. We needed one on there to kind of just even them out from hit to hit. And then we put another one on to help it enhance the kind of pop and the ring of that snare. So let's listen to it with the bass. Now the bass has a compressor on it. That's with no compressors. you can kind of hear it gives the impression of things being kind of louder, more exciting, more detailed than they really are. And this is just the stock compressor that comes in Pro Tools. This isn't even one that has a lot of fun in it. Let's take a look at this acoustic guitar and this piano. And then I want to show you in a different session how kind of this applies in a more real world sense. We'll take a look at an actual track with a vocal in it, and vocals are often the most difficult to compress. But look at this, you can just see this acoustic, how it's got a very strong initial attack and then a little tail at the bottom of it. So I can tell you right now, we're probably going to put a compressor on here that knocks down these peaks a bit. And we can kind of look at the difference between a quote-unquote compressor and a limiter. So let's see what this acoustic's doing. You can hear that initial pick attack compared to the rest of it's very annoying. And I bet in the mix, we're going to hear more of that kind of smacky pick sound and not a whole lot of the body of the guitar. So now we've got kind of two problems that I'm seeing. One, with each individual hit, there's too much of that initial pick. I also noticed that some of these chords just in general are louder than others. We can kind of see in this area here, it gets quiet compared to here. This area, this kind of turnaround section, is way louder compared to the rest of it. So I need a compressor that's going to even out the individual hits. I need a compressor that's going to even out the whole performance. And this is kind of a situation where we're definitely going to use two compressors, but what order do we put them in? Well, I'm going to use a more limiter style compressor to knock down those really quick transient peaks at the beginning of each note. Very fast attack so that it grabs them, and a fast release so that it lets go of them and lets the body of that acoustic guitar come through. I'm going to put a more general low ratio compressor that evens out from section to section. Now, in this particular case, I want to put the limiter first because I don't want those really loud peaks to be knocking my normal compressor into like extreme compression when it's the one that I'm trying to use to go from section to section. So first and foremost, let me put this limiting compressor on there to knock down some of those peaks. Again, I'm going to put my threshold up, ratio down, attack slow, and let's look at what we got. Loud peaks are up here, going above -12. The body of the guitar is down here about -18. Okay, so I'm going to put my threshold at -18. I'm going to knock down those peaks. I'm going to go high ratio because I want this to really clamp down on those peaks once they go above the threshold. 20 to 1. But my compressor's too slow. I'll start to make my attack quicker. We're going to start to see it clamp down. There it is. You can hear some distortion going on there. When my attack's too fast, you hear lots of distortion. Let's hear what my release does. There we go. I'm starting to hear the body a little bit more because it's letting go. Turning down my ratio to try to get rid of some of that distortion. Again, I'm not trying to fix all my problems with this one, I'm just trying to make it a little bit better. Now I'll put another compressor on there, low ratio, probably a little bit slower on the attack and release. Let's see. All right there, make sure everything's getting compressed a little bit, really low ratio. I'm gonna go 2 to 1. kind of hear without the compressors, now all I really hear is that sound. I'm not getting much of the actual note of the guitar. With the compressor, I can hear the sustain of the guitar. Even quicker here. All right, last but not least, let's take a look at this piano. Single note hits. I want to show you a real fun thing you can do with pianos. Each individual hit is about the same volume, but a piano has a lot of initial attack, and then there's a lot of fun stuff that happens in the tail of it. So we're going to use a compressor to bring out the tail of this piano. Then we're going to time our release so that it lets go just as the next note's about to hit. Let me set my threshold to where the release dies away, about here at -30. Good medium ratio. Now if I set my attack really quick, you can kind of hear how it knocks down the hammer hit of that piano. But like a drum, I can set it so that the hammer hit comes through. There we go, we're starting to get some attack on that piano. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to time my release so that it just gets back to unity gain, or no compression, by the end of this hit. It's getting close. And so now the sustain of my piano doesn't die away, it stays much more even as it goes. If I want less of that hammer attack, I can move my attack quicker so it clamps down more. If I want more of the hammer attack, I can move my attack slower so that they come through. Now this is really aggressive. This wouldn't necessarily be what I do in a mix, but I want to show you how you can use this to kind of help your mix if you need to transient design. Soften the attack up. Compressor on any of the tracks. So that's how I like to use compressors. First, fix, even anything out that you need to adjust anything in terms of attack and release, where you can clamp down on things that you need to, and then enhance. With that piano, we didn't need to fix anything because all the hits were pretty much the same volume. So we got to just kind of enhance it there. Put one straight on there that is going to bring out the tail of it. With the acoustic, we fixed first any of those initial hits. We put a very fast limiting style compressor on there to try to clamp down on those pick attacks that were kind of poking through too much. And then we got to put another compressor on there that enhanced. It brought out the body a little bit more and evened out from hit to hit. Same thing with the snare drum. Put a fixer on there that just caught 3 or 4 of the snare hits there, the quiet ones, or sorry, the loud ones, that put them at the level of the quiet ones, and then an enhancing compressor that brought out the pop and the ring of it. Try to avoid attempting to fix all of your sounds, trying to get that perfect sound with just one compressor. Often you have to use 2 different ones with 2 different settings, or 3 sometimes. On vocals, I use 4 or 5 compressors sometimes, or things that are evening out volume between compressors and automation and stuff like that, to try to achieve what I want to achieve.